start. Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Mary-Ann Stephenson. I'm the director of the Women's Budget Group, and welcome to this webinar on the impact of the cost of living on women. This is something that the Women's Budget Group has been working on for the last few months, and I won't say very much about it because our first speaker, Dr Sara Reis, is our Head of Research and Policy, and she's going to present the findings of our research so far. We've also got a brilliant panel of three other speakers. So Victoria Benson, who is CEO of Gingerbread, will talk in particular about the impact of the cost of living crisis on single mothers. Then we have Elena Lisney, who is one of the co-founders of Sisters of Frida, which is a disabled women's collective, and she's going to present on the specific challenges faced by disabled women as a result of the cost of living crisis. And last but by no means least, Professor Gargi Bhattacharyya from the University of East London will highlight the impact of the crisis on women from minoritized communities. So we're going to have a kind of overview from Sara and then drill down into some particular groups that we know from our research has been and are being and will continue to be particularly badly affected by what is not only a crisis in the cost of goods, but also a crisis of incomes, and a crisis that has been a long time coming. So some of the rises in prices have been unexpected. Some are the result of the war in Ukraine, but others are to do with the fact that all of the groups of women we're talking about here today have faced the economic impact of 12 years of austerity, which has undermined their incomes, reduced their savings, made them more likely to be in debt, so with less of a cushion to deal with rising prices, as well as the specific impacts as a result of kind of multiple forms of structural discrimination. But I think it's really important to make that point at the beginning. This is not something that came out of nowhere. This is something that has been building up for a long time and is exacerbating an already extremely difficult situation for large numbers of women in the country. So we're going to have presentations first. Each speaker will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then there will be time for questions and discussion. If you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will put them to the panel after all of the presentations. So first of all, I would like to introduce Dr. Sara Reis.
Thanks very much, Mary-Ann. Hi, everyone. So my name is Sara. I'm Head of Research and Policy, and as Mary-Ann mentioned, we have been working on the gendered impacts of the cost of living crisis for the past few months. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give an overview of what these gender dimensions of the crisis are. And then my fellow panelists will drill down into the specific impacts on particular groups of women that we know are being disproportionately impacted at the moment. So why, I suppose the question is, why is this a gendered crisis? What are the gendered dimensions of this crisis? And I think it's very important to, when we're looking at this crisis and when we're trying to answer this question, to look at the women's economic position in our societies. And that position is very much a position of economic disadvantage. Their economic circumstances are generally worse than their male counterparts. And as Mary-Ann said, it's very important when we're looking at this crisis to focus not only on the rise in the cost of goods and the inflation side of things, but also to look at what is happening to incomes, what has been happening to incomes in the past decade or so, which has kind of built up to this point and got us and got women to where we are right now. So this is how we've been looking at this crisis. So looking at the price side of things, how the cost of essentials has been rising, things like particularly fuel, energy bills, housing costs, in particularly rents, food, and other essentials have been rising. The price of these things have been rising and driving inflation up to a record 40-year high on one hand, but then also looking at what has been happening to incomes. And on incomes, and this is where we also see a gendered element to this crisis, is the fact that women are poorer on average than men. So this is a consequence, as we know, of the gender pay gap. So women are paid less per hour than their male counterparts, but also women tend to work fewer hours. So they are more likely to work part-time than men, which means that overall women are paid, have lower earnings in total. And so what we've seen happening with wages in the last decade or so is that they've been stagnant for over a decade. And more recently, they are now falling in real terms because the inflation rate has been higher than wage growth, which means that wages are not keeping up with rising prices, and people are seeing in real terms they have less money in their pockets than they did a year ago or more. And I think it's also important when we're looking at incomes and we're looking at wages in particular and what's happening to wages, it's important to note that the wage growth in the public sector is even lower than in what is happening in the private sector. So both are not keeping up with inflation. They are rising in nominal terms, but they are not keeping up with inflation. But public sector wage growth is even lower than private sector. And this is very important, and it has a very important gender dimension because the majority of people working in the public sector are women. So the majority of the public sector workforce are women. And so women are being left behind when it comes to wages. And also, you know, public sector industries like social care, healthcare, childcare, and others that are essential sectors in our economy. And we've seen how essential they were, particularly in the pandemic. These are traditionally very low paid sectors. And we are seeing people, particularly women, who are the majority of workers in these sectors, abandoning these sectors because they just can't make ends meet on the current wages. And so what we're seeing is a shortage of workers in these essential sectors. And so what we're risking is lower quality public services and also problems in the provision of these essential services. So all of this also has a gender dimension. And so when we're looking at kind of the why women are poorer, why women earn less than men, at the core of this is really the disproportionate sharing of caring responsibilities. So women still bear the brunt of caring for others, which limits their ability to participate in the labor market, as we know. And also it limits women's ability to increase their hours or to move to a better paid job in a crisis like this, where they, you know, where some people might try to go for a better paying job in another sector or another company to try to make ends meet in facing the rising living costs. But for some women, that's just not an option because those jobs may be, they have less flexibility when it comes to conciliating with their caring responsibilities. The cost of childcare is too high for many women to be able to work more hours to earn more. And so again, women are restricted in what they can do when it comes to facing this cost of living crisis. So another dimension that we've been looking at when it comes to the cost of living crisis is what we know about families and the fact that women tend to be the shock absorbers of poverty in their households and in their families. So what we mean by this is two things. So in lower income households, so in poorer families, women tend to be the ones who manage the resources, the scarce resources, the budget, who make the decisions about what to purchase and where to shop and so in a situation where you have scarce resources where your income can't meet all the demands for the essentials of your family, it takes a huge mental toll on women to do this kind of impossible budgetary exercise of budgeting on very low resources. And we also know that women tend to go without essentials themselves, things like, go without heating or go without food, or not purchase an essential piece of clothing or whatever it may be essential, so that their children or their family doesn't go without. And so this also has that impact on women. So this is broadly the issue, and broadly the gender dimensions of this crisis, or a very sort of brief overview, which and I'm sure my fellow panelists will go into a bit more detail in some of these things and expand and say how specific groups of women are impacted by these. In terms of what we would like to see done, so we are currently going through the Tory party leadership contest. We've seen how several candidates have promised tax cuts and how they would cut taxes to spur the economy and to promote growth and to help people with the cost of living crisis. Well, we know that tax cuts are not the answer, because they are a very poorly targeted measure to support the people who are dealing with the brunt of this crisis. So tax cuts are mostly tax cuts, they don't do much to support the poorest. They don't do much to support the poorest in our economy, because the poorest they don't pay income tax, they don't pay national insurance contributions, or they pay very little, and so the respite that they would have from these tax cuts would be practically non-existent. And so the vast majority of the tax cuts would benefit the people who are better off, the people for whom the living crisis. So the people who have a bit more maneuver anyway to deal with the cost of living crisis. So what we would really like to see is our social security system being, properly used to support the people who are facing the brunt of this crisis. So we would like benefits to be rated in line with current inflation rather than last year's inflation, and we would like to see punitive measures like the 2-child limit and the benefit cap removed, because these are affecting particularly large families, and we know that large families are also bearing the brunt of the cost of living crisis, because obviously they have higher costs to begin with of essentials than others. So that's me. That's an overview. I look forward to the discussion and to hearing from our the rest of the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara. That's great. I'm now going to move on to Victoria Benson from Gingerbread, who's going to talk specifically about the impact of the crisis on single mothers.
Thank you, Mary-Ann. So, and thank you to the Women's Budget Group for inviting me to speak today. As you just heard, I'm Victoria Benson, Chief Exec of Gingerbread, which supports single parents. And I think it's really important to be able to speak to you about the rising costs of living and the impact these are having on single parents. 90% of single parents are women. And at Gingerbread, we're hearing every day from single mums who are hugely anxious about the soaring costs of food and fuel. Our helpline has seen more calls than ever from people who are extremely worried about how they're going to provide for themselves and their children. And we're hearing really horrendous accounts of people going without food, worrying about how they will pay their bills. And we know it's just going to get worse. The winter with the increased fuel bills is just too awful to contemplate. And unsurprisingly, anxiety levels are really high and mental health is suffering. One parent told us, single parents have always been in this position where it's been a dangerous balancing act and something you can never stay on top of. With living costs going up even more, it's incredibly scary. And this is a situation that's going to get worse. The reality for many single parents, especially those on low incomes, is that they know they won't be able to absorb the ever-increasing costs of essentials. They don't have savings or luxuries that they can cut from their budgets. They really are looking at decisions around food or fuel. But as Sara said, although this crisis is horrendous, it's not new. Single parents' budgets were already at breaking point. So years of low wages, 12 years of austerity measures, benefit cuts and freezers, punitive benefit policies, and the lowest rate of child benefit for 20 years have all contributed to hitting those with the least the hardest. And even before 2020, single parent households were twice as likely to be in poverty as couple families. They had the highest rates of poverty in terms of income, in terms of spending, and in terms of financial wealth, meaning that single parent families already had less money coming in and more money going out, and very little, if any, in the way of savings to protect them against a financial emergency. And then the pandemic happened, and the last 2 years have been truly devastating for single parent families. Gingerbread research published last year found that average debts for single parent households increased by 13%, or £600 per family. And we know also that many single parents lost hours or income, or even their jobs. And costs of food, of childcare, of rent had already started to increase. And then, of course, in October 2021, they lost the £20 a week UC uplift. So things were pretty desperate even before the cost of living crisis. And as a result, the rising cost of living is part of a perfect storm of financial pressure that's going to push many more single parents and their children further into poverty. The prices of essentials are rising at an eye-watering rate. The cost of food, childcare costs, rent and bills are all increasing rapidly. And of course, fuel. The energy price cap is now predicted to rise by 65% in October, taking typical bills to a horrific £3,240 a year. And then they're going to rise again in January. The Resolution Foundation has said that the poorest households will see their energy spend rise at proportionally 3 times the rate of richer households. And all of this is likely to disproportionately impact single parent families. Single parents are understandably incredibly worried about how they will meet these spiralling costs. We're hearing every day from women who are going without food so that their children can eat, who are having to choose between paying their rent or bills or other expenses because they can't afford them all, who can't afford even the basics. And women are phoning our helpline asking where they can get urgent funds to help them provide for their children. And going to a food bank has become standard, not the exception. We spoke to one single mum who had experienced debt and struggled to pay for food before, who said, "I worked full time and my daughter went to nursery, and that was the most hellish 3 years of our lives because we were just in constant debt and we were chasing our tails. There was no food. There were times when there was no food in the house and I'd have to visit a friend because my daughter was hungry. I'd take her there because I knew they'd feed her. That wasn't a way to live and I can't do it again. I'm not sure I'd survive it again." And of course, while prices are rising, income from earnings and benefits just aren't keeping pace. 3/4 of single parents are now on universal credit, and this is predicted to rise to 90% when the service is fully rolled out at the end of 2024. But benefits increased by just 3% in April, far short of the now 9.4% rise in inflation. This means that most single parents' families in the UK are facing a real terms cut to the amount they have coming in at a time when they need stable income more than ever. And alongside this, Gingerbread research has found that single parents are struggling to find work that is flexible and pays enough. There's a shortage of part-time roles, which single parents often need in order to juggle their caring responsibilities with work. Increasing their hours doesn't increase their take-home pay because it's quickly swallowed up by childcare costs. So what needs to change? The situation facing single parents is really bleak, but we're asking for 4 actions that we'd like the government to take to support single parents and their children. Firstly, ensure that benefits keep pace with inflation so that those on universal credit don't face another real terms cut of absolutely essential economic support. The one-off support measures that have been introduced are a start, but quite simply, single parents don't have enough income week on week to pay for the basics. Number 2, they should put in place financial support to meet additional energy costs, particularly through existing schemes like the Warm Home Discount Scheme. Thirdly, they should review the child maintenance service. It simply isn't fit for purpose. And we know for those single parent families in poverty, 60% of them would be lifted out of poverty if the children received the child maintenance they were entitled to. And longer term, there should be a review of minimum income, similar to the Minimum Wage Commission, to ensure that families can meet their living costs. We want to see the end of this huge mismatch between what single parents have and what they need to get by. And this isn't about luxuries. It's about parents and families being forced to choose between paying the bills or putting food on the table. And of course, there are other areas that should be looked at, including the cost and availability of childcare, ensuring that there's flexible work for single parents and support to get them back into work, universal credit and the way it reimburses childcare costs, sanctions, the 2-child limit, the benefit cap, all of which disproportionately affect single mums. And I'll leave you with the words of one single mum that we spoke to about how they are being impacted by the cost of living crisis. She said, "My children don't ever go without, but I will. This week I've only eaten 1 cheese sandwich in 3 days. I don't eat regularly. I use free sites for clothes, shoes, and to replace furniture. Don't use heating in my bedroom, don't smoke or drink, don't have a social life. But this way, my kids have everything that they need and they don't go without." Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. That was really powerful and a really powerful example of what Sara was talking about women being the shock absorbers of poverty. Yeah. I'd now like to hand over to Elena Lisney from the Sisters of Frida. Eleanor.
Thank you, Mary-Ann, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I'm a co-founder, but I'm also a director of Sisters of Frida. I must apologize first if you hear any bangings. I wasn't expecting it, but I think my neighbor have just started doing their bathroom or something. So yeah.
Brilliant timing for you.
Yeah, it was a bit of a surprise. Even before the this cost of living crisis, Scope has done research and said in 2019 that on average, disabled people face extra costs of £583 a month. And on average, a disabled person's extra costs are equivalent to almost half, including that's not including housing costs. So 1 in 5 disabled people face extra costs of more than £1,000 a month. I'm mentioning this because it has a relevance. This is before the cost of the living crisis. And there is and I'm going to focus on the gender difference here, but I mentioned because if it affects disabled people, it affects disabled women. So everything that Victoria and Sara has said affects disabled women because of the kind of intersectionality, and we have disabled women in all sectors, single mothers and women who are disabled women are also carers. They also work in public service. Just give me a second. My notes have disappeared. So I'm just going to speak from memory. The gender differences with disabled women is something like the crisis when it comes to washing and costs and the sort of menstrual poverty that hits disabled women as well. The cost of living. If I can just use myself, I can say that my electricity costs have gone up a lot. And if you consider the sort of stuff that I have that maybe a non-disabled woman does not have, for example, I have to charge out my electric wheelchairs. I have extra costs when it comes, I've mentioned this, to washing. And all the kinds of electricity that I use. And I don't luckily need that, but some of my friends do, is they need oxygen and special equipment that they cannot exist without, and that all needs electricity. So it all mounts up, you know, but I think one of the greatest crises for a disabled woman, maybe as well as men, or more as a woman, is the cost of having personal assistants. And a lot of personal assistants are women, and some people call them carers. Because, as Sara has said, the cost of living for women has gone up. So that impacts on disabled people, on disabled women, because if the core of your support comes from this group of people, or women, then it affects you. For example, my council has not increased direct payments for personal assistance for carers. That means that I find it very difficult to keep people working for me, to support me in my personal care, in support for me to work, in support for me to even go out, to do my shopping, etc. If they don't get the kind of money that they need, then they can't afford to work for me, however much, you know, they care for me, care in the sense that they like me. So in the end, I have to have less support, because, for example, one of my PAs is a single mother. You know, how is she expected to be able to afford working for me if she has to keep up with caring for her own children? That's just one example. Food has gone up. Food delivery has gone up. Now, if you can't go out shopping yourself, if you depend on food being delivered, whether it is your local restaurants, your local takeaways, even my local Nando's, you know, that means that my food is affected. And Victoria has already mentioned food, but if you're a disabled woman, can you consider, if you can't cook for yourself, then you have to consider the cost of delivery. And if, for example, if you don't have support to help you cook, then how do you feed yourself? So all that is impacted and also benefits hasn't gone up, and I don't need to go into that because I think Sara and Victoria and other people probably would mention that that doesn't go up with inflation, that doesn't go up because there is a cost of living crisis. So all that mounts up, and I've spoken to other disabled women. They say medication for them has gone up, you know, and I am, maybe some of us are more fortunate than others because we haven't gone to the status where we don't have the food on the table. But there are people who have, and it's not just a case of money, it's also a case of people who care for you. For example, you don't have a carer or a personal assistant and you're stuck in bed and there's nobody to actually physically bring you the food, then you do starve. I hope that makes sense, you know, because it's not just, it's the impact, but not maybe the direct impact of having less money, but the impact of, thank you, the impact of not having kind of support that you would need. And PA costs is so important to support for disabled women who need to live. And I think if I make a plea is for the government or for local councils to consider taking the kind of direct payments that they can give to PAs to be able to support disabled women to just have a life, to survive. I don't think I'm making I don't think I'm I don't think I'm scraping the barrel by saying that. It is a case of survival when it comes to food, and it's not the direct impact of not having the money to pay for the food, but not being able to access the food sometimes, and medication and support to work. If I can finish on that, is one of the impact on this being able to be here is, or not nearly not being able to be here, is because my PAs couldn't make it. And I have to give them that consideration because I can't afford to give them the kind of money that they could find just working in Tesco's, for example. Thank you. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you, Eleanor. I think that there's some really important points in there, both about the additional costs faced by disabled women and disabled people more generally, but also specifically this issue of the kind of knock-on effect, particularly when you're talking about personal assistance. And as you say, the fact that the amount of money to pay those personal assistants isn't enough to pay at a rate that can compete with Tesco's for a job that is, requires more. And one of the reports we're going to be doing later on this autumn is looking at the kind of knock-on impact of the cost of living on access to services. And I think this would be something that would be really important to include in that. So our final speaker, and thank you very much for your patience, Professor Gargi Bhattacharyya, who is going to talk about the impact of the cost of living crisis on women from minoritized communities, and has some slides. Gargi. You're on mute though.
Sorry, didn't realize I was on mute. Can we go to the first slide? Thanks so much. Right. I haven't really prepared in the same way, and I think a lot of the ground in terms of everyday experience has been covered by speakers already. I'll try and explain why I want to raise some slightly different questions in the hope that we can have a conversation of goodwill amongst people of goodwill. I think there's a question about how we think about inequality. And I think when we talk about things like disproportionality, there's an implication that there's an acceptable norm. And if you're a subordinated group, you fall below the norm. But already from the speakers we've heard and other things we know, hardship in the society we live in right now is very, very widespread. There might be some contestation about what an acceptable norm of hardship is, but it isn't focused in one particular place. And I do wonder if focusing on the disparities between the quite poor and the very poor might not be our most useful way forward. Can I have the next slide, please? So, of course, there is a structural inequality that racially subordinated women face in this society. A lot of it is very well documented. Some of it has been alluded to. Certainly issues around labour market participation, issues around housing, issues around household income, size of family, and the income impact that has on your overall economic position. But I wonder if instead of thinking of it as a crisis which disproportionately impacts some people, we should think of it as a crisis that's differentiated but still very much shared, sadly, as we've already heard, between very different groups of people. And that there might be ways that we can talk to each other about structural racism and perhaps other kinds of structural inequality that could help us understand what is it about this crisis that exacerbates the tension points for poor communities. Can we go to the next slide, please? Right. I've already said, look, we already know from quite long-standing data that most racially minoritized groups are more likely to be poor. There's greater broadness of outcome amongst Indian and Chinese groups, but there's some very, very poor people within both of those ethnic groups. And we know that there are well-documented challenges around housing, employment, and access to services. If anything, the pandemic has thrown a brighter light on how systematic that barrier to services is. But what we're describing in terms of the impact of the cost of living crisis isn't really easily comprehensible if we look at any particular ethnic group. I could say to you, oh, Bangladeshi women are having this kind of bad time, or traveller women are having this kind of bad time. But I'm not sure that altogether helps us in terms of the conversation we have with each other. Can I have the next slide, please? As I've already said, we know that for women and children who are facing racialized poverty, that there's still quite low levels of paid employment for some groups, although that has been changing quite quickly. Extremely high levels of child poverty. I didn't even bother to list it here. People probably know that children from Bangladeshi, Pakistani, and some Black households are more likely to live in poverty than not. Very high levels of disability and chronic illness, because the devil doesn't only hit you in one way at a time. And although there have been rapid increases in the proportions of Bangladeshi and Pakistani women engaged in paid work, because that used to be an almost double disparity, but there's been quite a lot of change in recent years, in-work poverty still remains very high. Can you see the next slide, please? That just tells you a picture. I think, oh, it's from Joseph Rowntree, but this is just in case sometimes people respond to a picture. It just shows you that actually, in terms of in-work poverty rates, which we know are extremely high across all communities, they're, a third of people in Bangladeshi and Pakistani households are living with in-work poverty. Next slide, please. But even as we understand those kinds of disparities, we all know that racially minoritized groups don't live separate lives. They're not doing some kind of special low-paid work over here that no one else does, or they're not living in rubbishy housing over here that no one else lives in. The crisis points and the experience of racially minoritized groups illuminate something about the systemic blockage points in our society And perhaps instead of thinking about why Group X has, for example, such high levels of housing poverty, maybe we could try and talk together about how the cumulative barriers faced by any particular group lead to that outcome. And I hope the last few things I say give you an indication of what I mean by that. Next slide, please. Got a few pictures that I stole off the Health Foundation. Health Foundation have done very good little set of pictures about how we think about rental poverty, who rents and who spends a lot of their money on rent. First slide, of course, is age. You know, we know that the younger you are, the more likely it is that an unfeasible amount of your income goes towards housing. Next slide. If you add into that issues around ethnicity, you also start to see that there's great disparity there, including for white others, you know, largely white migrant groups who have pay a larger amount of their household income on housing than even Black and brown Britons. But of course, also, all of the minority ethnic groups are much likely to be younger. So the previous picture about how younger people are more harshly impacted by housing costs combines together to show us two different kinds of terrible way that people in a cost of living crisis find their lives hard. Next slide, please. I didn't know loads about this, so all of these pictures are stolen, I'm afraid. It's just a way of telling a quick example about something we know is increasing very, very rapidly. Rent is an identifiable pressure point. We know that rents are rising exponentially. Looking at who rents and who is forced to move might help us to grasp the manner in which this crisis is hitting. The graph from the English Housing Survey shows you, and ONS repackaged this, shows you again that there's big disparity in terms of levels of renting, but some groups, again, white other, Chinese people and Asian others have got very, very high levels of renting, quite high levels for Black Africans and Black other. Next slide, please. And how we understand the impact of renting in a cost of living crisis, renting that already eats into the areas where you're a bit more vulnerable. So yes, being racially minoritized, but also being younger, probably being precariously employed, perhaps being a recent migrant. It tells us something about how this cost of living crisis, because each cost of living crisis is not quite the same, how it plays out against the landscape of inequality. It also matters who you ask about rent. I just wanted to share this very kind of sobering graph. But the IPHRP, which I can never remember what it's called, but it's like the official thing about housing rental prices. That's the blue line. That shows that rents are going up, but it says, oh, they're going up really a lot. It looks like 2% since last year. If you look at sites like Zoopla and Rightmove, which many, many people who have to move house all the time use, you see instead these exponential rises. It's almost a vertical line upwards. So there's also something about where we look to understand what the crisis is and for whom. Sorry, I'll need to speed up. Next slide, please. It's extremely likely, you know, as predictable as anything is predictable, that racially minoritized women will face additional challenges during this phase of economic crisis. However, they will not be alone in this. Next slide. And I wanted to really end with a couple of points about how we think about that. And I say it in full awareness that the previous speakers all spoke about disproportionality and spoke very well about it. But if I speak about disproportionality and the kind of hardship that racially minoritized women are facing, the only way I can make that argument is to implicitly place those women in competition with the perhaps white woman who is eating one cheese sandwich every 3 days, or the woman who cannot have a hot meal today because they can't afford their personal assistance. Disproportionality is always a comparative lens. So in every space where additional hardship arises, other life histories will always also be present. Of course, Black and brown people are also disproportionately, I say it myself, you know, more likely to be disabled and have chronic illness, There are all kinds of overlaps, but also adjacent experiences of state violence and or neglect. We know that having been through the prison system or the care system hugely increases your likelihood of living in poverty. But most of all, the widespread impoverishment of the new normal that we've all been speaking about leads to a place where I am not convinced that disproportionality is the right tool to challenge injustice. And so my last slide is this. I think that the landscape of racialized inequality, the landscape that ensures that racially minoritized women continue to have a bad time and perhaps still even a worse time than women who are not racially minoritized, but that might depend on other factors. What it does, it throws into relief the cumulative processes of dispossession and disadvantage that make some people so much more likely to suffer extreme material hardship. It's not an instant, it's cumulative. You go through the phases. So think of race as a process, a journey through official institutions and opportunities and assembled social goods, not something I hold in my body, but a kind of marker that I carry through different spaces. I think an equivalent way of thinking might be the social model of disability. Like, what is the racialized barrier every moment? And the arbitrary marker of race shapes how well or badly each encounter goes. And I have one last slide. Race also lets us know what resources a person might be carrying or be able to access and how under or unprotected they might be in the public square. And we might think about that, about in a time when many, many people are hungry, many different kinds of people are in crisis, many people cannot put their heating on. What are the frameworks of under or unprotection for different people? And are there ways that we can think of that in a way that's not distinct groups? I think the analytic tools that arise from charting the cumulative process that makes some more likely to be poor. So step by step, in each instance, try and count or measure or make visible what disadvantage means, and then look at why that's not different from some other people. I hope might open the possibility of re-articulating how we survive and thrive together. Because as long as we are trying to prove our disproportionate disadvantage against each other people live lives that don't have to think about this at all. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gargi. That was really fascinating, and I think you know, a real challenge for those of us who are used to thinking in terms of disproportionality. I'd love to have a longer conversation with you about this, but probably not now, because I don't want to abuse Chair's privilege by saying, please can we talk about this for the next 3 hours? So what I'm going to do is throw the last section open to questions. We've had 2 questions in so far from Rachel Reis, and anybody else who wants to add some more, please do so. So the first one is, I'd love to know more about the benefit cap for 3 or more children that was highly contentious and received a lot of bad press. Did it have an effect? Has it been eclipsed by worse news since then? And then a follow-up question, which is, in terms of the candidates to be Prime Minister, is one of them the better of a bad bunch for within stroke cost of living? Interested to hear the panel's opinion. Well, we're waiting to see if anybody else has got any further questions to put in the chat, or anybody wants to respond to other panelists for the sort of challenge that I think Gargi posed to us about the approach that we're taking, which I think is, you know, is a really important challenge. I will kind of throw that open, and I will go first to Victoria, maybe on the 2-child limit.
I mean, I don't know the details of the research, but I think there's a fair amount of research which has said that the benefit cap and the 2-child limit hasn't worked, and all it's done is caused a lot of pain and economic injury on we're talking about single parents, but I suspect everybody. And no, it hasn't worked, but there's no acknowledgement that it hasn't worked. And you know, it carries on, and it still has a big effect. We still get a lot of people phoning our helpline who are affected by it, and who, you know, don't have enough to live on, particularly in London.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that that and the benefit cap were both more about a symbolic statement than actually about saving any money. Yeah. They weren't ever really intended to save money. They were intended to send a signal. And I think particularly with the benefit cap, they were intended to reinforce an idea that people on benefits were getting a lot of money that other people weren't getting. By setting this cap, the sort of implication for a general public who might not know about benefit levels is that's the level of benefits people were getting, or people were getting more than that as a matter of course, which of course they weren't. It was in very particular circumstances where you've got, you know, often larger families, often with disabled children who had additional needs, often with high housing costs because of being in London or other expensive cities. Sara, I don't know if you want to say anything about the benefit cap or indeed venture.
Yes, just to say that obviously it impacts particularly larger families. And when we look at the support that was announced in May from Rishi Sunak, the then Chancellor, these one-off payments that were being paid to people on UC, so on universal credit, they were one-off payments and they were flat rate payments. So they were given to households no matter their you know, their size. And so at the time we highlighted the fact that large families were losing out, because obviously if you give the same amount of money to a single person as you give to a family of 5 or 6, well, that family of 5 or 6 are having much higher costs, and so the support is not enough, and they are being impacted, or they may be impacted by the benefit cap and the 2-child limit. So it's, I think, they are losing out from these punitive measures and are not being supported elsewhere through the other packages that were announced.
Thank you. So, Eleanor, do you have anything to say on the benefit caps and benefit systems more generally, or indeed on the Conservative leadership race, if you feel that there's anything suitable for broadcast to a wider world?
No. It's a bit like watching a serial. You want to see the end. You don't want to go through the painful process of watching the whole thing.
Okay, fair enough. Gargi, benefit caps or leadership?
The only thing I was going to say about benefit caps, to really build on what you were saying, that I do think that the various so-called welfare reforms, as you say, they didn't even pretend to be money in the account, that it wasn't about money saving. It was partly theatre, but it was also to make claiming benefit actively painful. And it's an echo of the hostile environment. Everything that's been learned about bordering and how to make the hostile environment says, even if it costs more money, we want to make sure that if you're a migrant, your life is as horrible as it can be, because if you want to come here, we're going to make it as hard as possible. That logic is built into the kind of benefit reforms. So the fact that they don't save money is neither here nor there. The fact that they cause pain and hardship is precisely the objective. And sadly, I think both of the last 2 candidates in the leadership race are very invested in that kind of politics still. And we need to speak to each other in ways that doesn't rely on them hearing, in terms of how, because that can't be our politics for the next number of years.
Mary-Ann, can I just add?
Eleanor, of course, yes.
I didn't say that much, but I just want to add on what Gargi has said, is the pain of, you know, applying. And as from a minoritized, so racial group myself, I didn't want to go on to that. But if you're disabled, as well as from my minority group, I don't want to compare, but it's doubly painful, especially if you're a new immigrant, as I have some of my friends are. So I'm gonna stop there. It's just painful, and I don't really want to go on about it. I'm sure people.
It reminds me, I remember speaking to a lawyer friend about it was about the appraisals for access to disability benefits, and saying, and she was saying, you know, they've learned from what happened with the asylum system, where you create a culture of disbelief. So the starting point when faced with a claim is this person must be lying for some reason. And then they have to demonstrate that they're not lying, rather than a starting point, which is actually, you know, we have a benefit system that is there to support people. We have an asylum system that should allow people to enter the country and live safely. It's, you know, anybody using the system is in some way trying to take advantage of it, and therefore we have to treat them with suspicion.
And if I can just add one more point, yeah. Sorry, Mary-Ann.
Go on.
And that is, I'm sure it's kind of evident today that my speech has been affected. But if your language is not English to start off with, then you are at a real disadvantage. I'm just going to stop that, because even though I have a reasonable command of the language, you know, when it comes to being questioned on those sort of things, you hesitate and you stop, because you just feel emotionally, psychologically unable to be able to cope with it. And that's also a reason why I don't want to dwell on it.
Yeah, no, that's understood. The final question we've got time for, Siobhan Harding, do you think there's been much of a shift in the stigma around benefits since the cost of living crisis? We're concerned about one-off payments being seen as the answer to this crisis. How do we work to ensure that this is not the government's answer? Sara, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
We thought there was going to be a shift in the pandemic, when suddenly a lot of people who had never thought that they would need to rely on benefits started to rely on universal credit. And there was this outcry that, you know, universal credit is very difficult. It has the 5-week wait. Why does it have the 5-week wait? So this conversation suddenly was reaching more people, a wider audience than it usually does. And so we thought that there was going to be something there and some movement. Unfortunately, I don't think that has been much the case. I think there was a second part of the question, the one-off payments.
Yes.
It's interesting because we feel like one of the reasons why the government decided to go with the one-off payments rather than incorporating them as part of the, you know, the social security system was to circumvent actually the benefit cap and the 2-child limit, which we thought is a tacit recognition that these measures are punitive, and these measures, so actually in a way they were, yeah, they were trying to circumvent their own punitive system, which we found rather odd. And certainly I think our preferred method going forward would be for social security benefits to be rising in line with inflation, rather than these one-off payments that have some limits to them.
I mean, actually, we need to rise higher than inflation if we to make up the ground that's been lost in all the cuts over the last 12 years. Gargi, any response to that or final thoughts? No, okay. Victoria? Eleanor? That's a bit of a depressing note to end it on. However, I do think that there is an important point, and there's a really important point in what Gargi said, which is that, you know, this is a crisis that is affecting all sorts of different people in all sorts of different areas. I mean, I do think it's important to drill down and look at particular groups, and I also think it's important to see the different experiences of different groups who can end up in the same place but for different reasons. But I also think the point about trying to recognise the common situation and the common cause, and which is essentially about building solidarity, isn't it, rather than further divisions, is is the most important one and the most important way forward. And I would hope that, you know, as people are being hit by the cost of living crisis and they recognise the reality of what it's like to be worried about feeding your kids and keeping a roof over your head, that can lead to a response which is about kind of sympathy and solidarity with other people in that situation, rather than a, you know, this happened to me which is not my fault, but all these other lazy people, well, they had it coming because, you know, they've done this, this and this. And I think all that we can do is keep trying to make those links and those connections. So we're a couple of minutes over time, so I do need to end because I know people have got lots of things to get on with their day for. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. A video of the webinar will be available on our website, along with copies of slides and anything else that our panelists want to send us to link to that they think we should read and would find useful. And yes, we will keep working on this. We've got more reports coming out in the autumn, and very interested in hearing from anybody who's got evidence, case studies, examples that they would like to share with us. So thank you all very much. Bye-bye.